The next screening in Unknown Pleasures on the 9th of July is a film called Celia, Australian feature film from 1988. And it's my great pleasure to be speaking to Anne Turner, who is the writer-director of Celia, and Digby Houghton, who is the curator for this Unknown Pleasures event. Welcome to Movie Metropolis.
Hi, Peter. Thanks for having us.
Pleasure. Now,
Thanks.
Anne, this is such an interesting film which dovetails a number of issues, if you like. And I noticed that it also received an Augie in 1984 for the best unproduced screenplay. Tell me
Yes.
about the origins of Celia.
It actually started when I was at film school at Swinburne, and I read an article in the Age newspaper about the Balti government rabbit muster because rabbits had finally been made legal after they'd been banned in the 1950s. And this was the early 1980s when they finally were, actually legally allowed to be kept as pet rabbits in Victoria. And I went back into the story of the Balti government's rabbit muster, where Henry Balti was a very conservative premier, and he decided, because pet rabbits were a real pest in the country, he thought he'd win votes by banning all rabbits. So he banned pet rabbits and told everyone they had to either destroy their rabbits or take them to the zoo. And kids got really upset. So even really conservative parents started protesting until the government changed its decision, and everyone had to go to the zoo and collect their rabbits. And of course, there were hundreds of rabbits running around, all looking the same. No one knew whose was whose. And it was just a terrible disaster. And it just struck me as a wonderful way, a metaphor of the way governments behaved. And at the same time, I realised that was in the late 50s. And I had a friend who'd moved from Melbourne to Adelaide, and I grew up in Adelaide in the late 50s because her father was in the Communist Party and he was working for a government department, the PMG, which was the forerunner of Telstra. And he was given an ultimatum to either leave the party or get the sack. And in the late 50s, there'd been the Hungarian uprising. Communists in Australia were really questioning whether they'd stay in the party. And so it was a really tumultuous time, but there was also a witch hunt here, which wasn't sort of as well known as the witch hunts in America of communists. And so it was the whole Reds under the bed scare too. And that seemed to dovetail nicely with the rabbit muster. So it was those two things. And I realised it was too big a film for me to do as my final year Swinburne film. And so I saved it and then kept writing it. I worked at Film Victoria as a creative development officer. So I was working really film culture, film festivals, that sort of thing. But at weekends, I'd write Celia. And that went on for a number of years. I moved up to Sydney and worked at what was then the Australian Film Commission. And again, was working at nights and weekends writing the script. So it was quite a long process writing the script after hours, basically.
And it is really such a good script because of the focus on children, the focus on family, and just all of those ideas juxtapositioning in terms of seeing it through the eyes of a child and her experiences.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought The Eyes of a Child would be a good way of telling the story because it was about rabbits. And I had a pet rabbit, my pet big white rabbit like Celia does in the film. And my poor pet rabbit met a horrible end. A dog broke in and actually opened its cage and, yeah, met an awful end. So I think that really traumatized me as a kid. I was about Celia's age, 9 years old. And we also, of course, had the hobby arts in Adelaide. It was banned in Victoria in those years as being too scared for a school reader, but we still had it in Adelaide. So, and it was our favourite story when we were about 8 years old. We'd always request that if we had a choice. And I actually used the images of the dog chopped up. So the dog, little dog Turpy, barks at the Hobyahs to warn a little old man and a little old woman, its owners, of these beasts coming in the night. And the man just tells it to stop barking and chops him up. And then when the little old woman is taken away, the dog gets put back together again and goes off hunting the Hobyahs. Again, that sort of seemed to tie in really well with the witch hunt sort of stuff. And so basically, I think Celia, like Little Dog Turpie, like she sort of sees things, but she's not listened to in the film with really quite tragic results. I don't think her parents understand her. So that all sort of tied in with childhood. And then the childhood games, which get very dangerous. We did play some pretty dark games as children. And we did make traps, like we did them at the beach, but they make traps in a quarry. And looking back, I mean, we did run around in gangs all summer holidays and have, you know, these deep friendships and groups that we fought. And so I put all of that into the film. So I guess I was quite young when I started writing it, so childhood wasn't that far away from me. And I put a lot of my own childhood into it.
Okay. And you've mentioned the AFC. How easy was it then to get funding to be able to make the film?
Um, it it went through various stages of trying to get funding because that was in the age of 10BA, which was a tax scheme,
Yep.
and it didn't find its funding that way. It ended up government funding, but Hoyts were a really important factor. So Hoyts gave it a pre-sale, and that really got it across the line. And then it had the Australian Film Commission and Film Victoria funding in with it as an independent film. And
Uh-huh.
it had, I think it had Australian Film Commission script funding at some point. I think before I worked, yeah, definitely before I worked at the Australian Film Commission. So it was all those sort of ways of getting the film up in those days where you really always did, for an independent film, need government funding, and also you had to find some private funding as well and
Yes.
commercial funding.
Well, congratulations on persevering and getting all that together. It's really a fantastic result. And I must say the casting of the film, including, of course, Rebecca Smart, is just superb. How did you find Rebecca?
It was actually Mulliner's casting that I cast through, and I'd seen Rebecca in the Shirley and the
Ah,
Coca-Cola Kid and loved her. But I'd always imagined a child with dark hair, short brown hair, and dark eyes. And so I thought Rebecca was a fantastic actress, but she looked nothing like the character to me. And then I met her and I thought, yeah, she's it. She's just brilliant and totally understood what I wanted and was more experienced than me because she'd done these other productions. And so I actually asked her parents if I could dye her hair and cut it because she had long blonde hair, as in the film. And her parents said, absolutely not. I could not do that. And I'm so glad they did because now I can't imagine her any other way. It's that character any other way. It's so archetypally the 50s, an Australian kid in that era, and running around in all that beautiful sunshine with the long blonde hair. It just really works. Whereas the short black hair, I loved European films, and someone like Anna Torrent in Spirit of the Beehive. And so I think I was, swaying that way, but it made it a much more, I think, a much more honest portrayal of the role in casting Celia as blonde haired and blue eyed. And Rebecca just, I mean, she just to me makes the film. She was extraordinary to work with
mm,
and just so intuitive, could get into those deep, intense moments. And then when the camera stopped rolling, she'd just go and play with the other kids.
mm,
And so she was fantastic. And one of the things we did in preparing for the role is we went to Luna Park in Melbourne and just went on rides together. And she was fearless, absolutely fearless. And like far braver than me on these scary rides. And just great fun to be with. And she was just fun the whole way through. And then we had quite a good rehearsal period with all the kids. and we went through the script, but we played a lot of games. Marianne Fay was playing Celia's mother, Pat, and she's a comedian, and she was really big in those days as Kylie Mole
Yeah.
in the comedy company. And she's so funny. So I'd get her to come to rehearsals with the kids too. And she was just so warm and funny. And she really warmed things up. And so we had a lot of fun with the rehearsals. And at one point I took them to Open Channel, which was, a community video place. And we shot a scene. And the whole point was to show them how to do continuity. And I, so we shot the scene, went into a cutting room, and they were so film literate. They were saying, oh, it doesn't matter. You can cut around that. You can do this. You can do that. So they just really understood film to the point where they knew they had to have continuity, but they also were very savvy in how filmmakers do cut around things where the continuity isn't precise. But it was great fun. And I realized the kids I'd cast were absolutely right. And they were just engaged, very, very smart. They all got on really well with each other. And I think that comes out in the film where you
Mm.
see a real warmth between the kids,
Yes.
um, and then the rivalry, of course, is performed, but they all got on fantastically and just were very natural, I think. And I tried to cast kids with a good level of concentration because I think that's the important thing. Because if they don't, often they'll mouth the words. If you do a screen test and there are two kids, while one's saying the lines, the other will start mouthing their next words or mouthing the other one's words. And
Uh,
so you don't cast kids when they do that. So these ones all passed that test and just had a really good level of concentration that meant they were naturals, real naturals. Amelia Fruit, who plays Stephanie, I think at that point, straight after that, fairly soon after, she was in Neighbours, so she went on to do some things fairly soon. Um, but some were just out of school and plucked out of the schoolroom, and yeah, did a fantastic job.
they certainly did. I was very impressed. And of course, Victoria Longley, Nicholas Eady,
Yeah.
and Deborah Lee Furness.
Yes, yes, the wonderful Deborah Lee. The one she just makes the most perfect school teacher, like just the school teacher we all wanted.
Yeah, no, they all work together so really well. And I must ask you about recreating the late 50s because you've got some archival footage in there
Yes.
as well as actual the look and the feel of the late 50s. That must have taken quite a task to get right.
Yeah, and I was very lucky. Jeffrey Simpson was the cinematographer, and he was just fantastic. And so he got the warmth and the colours and gave it that sort of period feel without it being sepia toned. And Peter Lawson did a fantastic job, I think, in the production design because I wanted it subtle, and it is very subtle, I think. And then Rose Chong did the costumes. And my mother actually sent me wonderful little photographs, which were tiny little photographs in those days, black and white, but she wrote on them the colours of the dresses she was wearing. So all the dresses in the film were my mother's, and Rose Chong recreated them really wonderfully. And then the sailor suit, I had a sailor suit like that. And then Rose just had a real flair for the kids' clothes of the 50s. And so she just came up with these wonderful costumes and colours that I think were a huge part of giving the look of the film because a lot of the time they're running around in a quarry and
Hmm.
at the creek and things. So you're not getting the backdrop of 50s glaring in your face. So a lot of it is done with the clothes and the hairdos.
Yes. Oh, again, well done. And the counterpoint music of Chris Neal, I thought was really interesting too.
Yeah, Chris Neal's music is just sensational, isn't it? And it's timeless. It's absolutely timeless. And I think again, I wanted a sing-song sort of feel to it, Carnival of the Animals, and I also wanted a carnivalesque feel in general. And I think he took it much further and created something really unique. I think he was inspired by Suspiria,
Ah,
and so there's that sort of bells and things, and it's just a beautiful mix of things, and having a really strong theme, and then having those emotional um, the score when things are really emotional. We get the beautiful cello in. It's got a lovely range and depth, but I find that music, it is truly timeless, and I think that's an extraordinary feat. And I was just enormously lucky to have all those incredibly talented and experienced people on my first feature. Like, it really
yes,
helped me.
yes. No, well done on that. Let me bring Digby into the conversation. Digby, what was your response to the film when you saw it and selected it for Unknown Pleasures?
Well, I heard about Anne's work for a while. I kind of have a focus on Australian cinema, but hadn't quite delved into it until I was commissioned by Umbrella to write a booklet essay on Anne's, I think, 2006 film Irresistible, which stars Susan Sarandon, Emily Blunt, Sam Neill, Bud Tingwell.
Mm.
And I was just amazed when watching that it wasn't really spoken about a lot amongst kind of peers and both in discussions. And I really wanted to kind of right that wrong a bit. And I noticed Celia was Anne's debut film, and I think the biggest impression I had, which is sort of touching on what you both discussed, but for me the biggest thing is the way in which I mean, first of all, Anne's using period drama of the 50s to set her conflict, and that's really resonates with me because I'm currently writing a screenplay that allegorizes like the 70s and 80s of Melbourne film culture in kind of a slightly more contemporary era. But I also think that the tension between the rabbits, the tensions between the neighbors and politics, I think these layers of tension alleviated from certain downfalls that I think period films fall into because they speak more broadly. And I think touching on what Anne said before about the quarry and the creek, I don't re I tend not to like period films, but I think when they're done with an acknowledgement that you can't actually recreate the past that accurately, I think that they're actually far more evocative. And I think that Celia does exactly that with kind of minimal set and obviously sublime costume. Yeah, and I think also there's an element of what I've called the aesthetic of paranoia that I think is quite prevalent in Australian films of the 70s and 80s. And I think the fact that you're never really certain if Celia is, say, having a delusion or a paranoid thought, or if it's really real, I think that's something that is quite particular to Australian cinema. And I think it can be seen in a lot of that era. So that's also a personal reason I want to screen it.
Excellent
That's actually
explanation.
fascinating.
Yeah.
Sorry. It's really
And how do you
fascinating.
respond?
Well, I think that's just so interesting, this paranoia idea. It's not something I'd thought of in terms of, 70s and 80s films. And I'm now going to
Well,
rethink,
feel free
those
to read my
films.
honors thesis, Anne.
Yeah, I will. I definitely will. It's a really interesting, it's a very interesting thing because I immediately I can see where you're coming from, and a whole range of films, flash in.
Yeah,
So
like
yeah, it's a
I
funny,
focused on
interesting
Gillian
thing.
Armstrong's Singer and the Dancer and Albie Tom's Palm Beach and Peter Weir's The Plumber, which I actually
Yes,
think had resonances with Celia in terms of the kind of the neighbors move in, and that's the central conflict as well. Like that's sort of the tension of the
yes.
plumber is the unwarranted intruder.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I love Peter Weir's films. They were a big influence on me, I must say, like Picnic at Hanging Rock, Gallipoli. I mean, they were just extraordinary films, extraordinary films. And his sensibility is just so beautiful in his films. So, yeah, I mean, it was an exciting time in the 70s, growing up in those years and then going to film school, in the very late 70s, early 80s. I hadn't realized at the time how soon after that was to those pioneering filmmakers like Peter Weir. and Bruce Beresford, Gillian Armstrong. You know, I just thought, well, that's the film culture. But you look back, and I came fairly soon after. It didn't feel like that at the time. And so, yeah, you're sort of within it. And that's why I think this paranoia thing's really interesting, because I certainly haven't sat outside it and looked back at those films in that light. And it's really fascinating, fascinating. And there's certainly a bigger paranoia in Celia. You're absolutely right.
Yes, absolutely. No, that's a good observation. And I'm intrigued, when the film was released in the late 80s, what was the critical and audience response to it?
It was a really hard film to release. And Hoyts gave it the pre-sale, as I mentioned, and that got it across the line in terms of getting made. And I was really grateful to them. I was up in Sydney at that point working at Roadshow Coote Carroll, and Matt Carroll was very supportive of me being a writer director of Celia. And he gave me time off to go to film festivals, which was fantastic. He said, you know, you don't get this opportunity all the time. Very, very supportive. And at lunchtime, I was really close to Hoyt's main office in the city. And so I'd go across and I'd work with the marketing team. And you know, it was a hard sell. It's a hard film to position. And that was sort of partly what I wanted, because I had lecturers like Peter Tammer at Swinburne, which is now VCA. And, you know, they were great. They were experimental filmmakers. So they encouraged not doing cliched films. And so I didn't want the film to sit in a box. And that, I think it's interesting. I think they made it a really hard sell at the time. And it also has given it an incredible longevity. So, you know, it's one of those really strange paradoxes, I suppose. But at the time, you know, I had a hand in the publicity, so I have to take responsibility to it. Just didn't work. It didn't reach its audience. And, you know, maybe in those days, if it had been in another language, a foreign language, and shown in art house cinemas, probably would have had a very different life. So, you know, these are all the things that happen in a film's life. In England, it got amazing reviews. In Australia, it had just, do you remember the film? You'd be too young, Digby, but you might have read his thesis. Neil Gillett, he wrote for The Age, and he just demolished Australian films, and he demolished Celia, demolished it. And then it, you know, probably had some mixed ones. I know Ron Burnett wrote a beautiful piece in Cinema Papers, so it had mixed things. But England, the reviewers were just incredible, and Scotland, the reviewers were amazing, like really super positive. They really understood the film as a political film and a film about childhood. And yet, even with those extraordinary reviews, it didn't do much box office, and it had a very sympathetic distributor and exhibitors. So again, it struggled, even with amazing reviews. Like, I thought English critics were just nice. No, I've seen other sides since then with other films, but they were, you know, they were just amazing, absolutely amazing. So yeah, so, and then in America, it screened in New Directors, New Films in New York, and it also screened in Seattle, and it actually ended up getting in the 10 best films in Village Voice of that year. And so even though it didn't have a broad release, it got some really great reviews. Janet Maslin in the New York Times wrote a wonderful review. And so again, it had this terrific critical reception, but didn't get a mainstream release.
How interesting.
And then Europe, it was released in quite a number of European countries, and Japan, interestingly, it got a pre-sale to Japan, which was really interesting because of the war stuff in it. But yeah, the Japanese picked it up. So, but you know, and it went to a lot of international film festivals. I'm still catching up when I travel, trying to go to places that Celia screened, because they're really beautiful places in Europe that have the film festivals. And I couldn't attend them all, like I had to do some work, but I did go to quite a few. But so, yeah, it really did the film festival circuit as well. And people, it premiered in Berlin in the Panorama section.
Ah,
And it got a terrific reception there as well. And I got invited to some amazing parties after the screening. So yeah, it got a terrific reception in Berlin at that screening. Now I remember I hadn't been to a festival before that with my own film. And I'd been to Melbourne Film Festival with my short films, but not an international festival, and sitting in this huge cinema. And I think I was up the back to watch sort of people's reactions after I'd introduced it. And I just didn't know. People sat really still, and I just didn't know if they liked it or hated it. And then they applauded. And I'll never forget that moment of thank goodness.
how very, very interesting to hear that. That's yeah, it's amazing how films can travel.
Yes.
And I'm very familiar with Berlin, so I'm not surprised that they accepted your film.
Yes, of course, there was a whole sort of resonance with the Holocaust that German audiences found.
Uh-huh.
So with the rabbit roundup and the Holocaust. So it's interesting how different cultures read. And I think we all do that, don't we? We all bring who we are and what we've been through into watching a film. So a film's meaning is never really fixed, is it? It's depending on who's watching it, how we view it.
That's very true. And we were talking just before we started recording, Anne, about how now some critics see it as a horror film,
Yes.
and which I find very interesting, because I think it's far from a horror film, but it is about a young girl's journey with some very difficult circumstances. So, yeah.
Yeah, the folk horror is interesting. And a lot of my influences were horror films. So Curse of the Cat People, which ended up, I think, being credited as Robert Wise. It started with another director, and there was a lot of trouble on set, but it's a terrific film about childhood. It's black and white, in the 40s, I think, and it's got the sort of fears of childhood and the imagination of childhood, and there's the headless horseman in it. And I loved that film. And so I think that was an influence. And then I also loved Carnival of Souls. And that was another influence, particularly with the music. And so there were these horror, and I loved horror films. As a kid, we had awful movies with Deadly Earnest, and I'd watch all of them. And, the Curse of, and all those sort of dark, black and white, body
Yeah.
snatchers, all that sort of
Yeah.
thing. Grave robbers, Boris Karloff. And so all of that came in, I think, as I was writing Celia. And so all the voodoo stuff, I Walked with a Zombie, that was a favorite of mine. And so all of that came in actually as I was writing it. And so it's interesting that it's been picked up as horror, even though I thought I'd made a political film.
Mm.
But there are certain elements that fit with folk horror, like the voodoo dolls and the sort of pastoral setting. Even though it's the suburbs, it's the sort of, well, the suburbs wasn't that far out of the city, where it was pastoral in those days, pastures. And I guess the horror element of the hobby arts, very much a folk horror element. So I can see the resonances as folk horror. So it's fascinating, because when it was first released in America on video in those days, they put it out as Celia, Child of Terror, and I was absolutely horrified. And Child of Terror, and they positioned it as a just a schlock horror film, and that didn't reach an audience, because you'd be terribly disappointed if you wanted to see it as just a straight horror film. It's not scary in that way. And but I think folk horror is slightly different, because it does have that folk element. And Digby, you can probably talk about folk horror much better than me.
Folk horror.
Yeah.
I wouldn't know where to start, but horror's not really my forte, but I think it's interesting that it's having a resurgence more recently. It's been programmed a little bit. I think it's been restored by the NFSA. Um, and I think it's interesting that I like that it kind of needs this title of horror perhaps to fall into like a subculture um to renew its life in a way. But yeah, I think it's tricky. Yeah, I think it's tricky.
Yeah. Look, my Zoom is
Yeah.
rapidly running out. So, Digby, if you can just give the details of the Unknown Pleasures screening with Celia
Yep.
and Anne Turner.
Yep. Yep, sure. So July 9 at I think it's 8:30 p.m. Myself and Bill Mousoulis will be presenting Anne Turner's debut feature film from 1989 called Celia. We'll be screening the restored cut, I believe, from Umbrella. And it will be followed by a Q&A between myself and Anne. And I'm really looking forward to it and hope people can come down and support us.
Absolutely. I totally recommend it. And just while I have one more minute left or whatever, Anne, I must commend you also on Irresistible, which was such an excellent film, which you explained to me before we started recording, did very well on digital.
Yeah, DVD in those
DVD.
days. Yeah,
Yeah.
yes, that it made about $8 million Australian on DVD in America. So, it did incredibly well at that
Yes.
level.
And such a great cast.
Yes, exactly. That was an incredible cast. That really was amazing. And of course, Emily Blunt in a very early role. So
Ah.
Irresistible sort of had a bit of a long life too, because of Emily Blunt becoming such a star. That sort of gave it a kick along years later. So
I think
yeah,
I think also Dallas Dolls was screened recently, you're saying, Anne, and I think for a lot of our generation, particularly queer people, the films have a large resonance, I think. Your films, yeah.
well, Dallas Doll is really fascinating. We might run out of time on this one, but it was billed at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, who screened it, as a cursed film of queer Australian cinema. And it was hilarious because it was on the Internet Archive, a sort of bootleg copy with a whole lot of Australian film and television of that period. And it was actually a really good digitisation. And it's never been released on DVD or digitized officially. And it had amassed this massive audience there. So it was actually the biggest audience of any Australian film, and was heading to 500,000 views. And we'd all watch. I had to watch it again because I hadn't seen it in years or decades. So I watched it, got up to Sydney, or just before I went up to Sydney, I went to watch it again, and they did too, and it was gone. And all those Australian films and television pieces had been taken off the Internet Archive. So someone must have complained about copyright, and the whole lot got taken down. And so now Dallas Doll has disappeared again. So just when it screens in Sydney at the Art Gallery, it disappears. And it's just so bizarre because at the screening, it was like its time had come. I'd never sat with such a good audience. It was like now people really understand the queerness in the film. And 90s are back, and the costumes are sensational. And they're just amazing 90s costumes. So Isaac Mizrahi had done Sandra Bernhardt's costumes, and they are exquisite. And you
Yes.
sort of appreciate them anew because the 90s are back in fashion. And there's a Paul Kelly song that's never been heard outside the film. It's just wonderful. The
Yeah.
music, it's retro, but it works. And we're listening to retro 90s now. So it's just really interesting how its time has come, but it sort of disappeared.
Yes. I'd better stop now.
It's a
My
funny
Zoom
old
is.
film, that one.
Yeah, we've been speaking to Anne Turner, writer-director of Celia, screening at Unknown Pleasures on July 9th, and Digby Houghton.